Warm greetings to you in the name of Jesus Christ. My name is Sarah Bixler, and it is my pleasure to join you from Martin Chapel at Eastern Mennonite Seminary in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where I teach formation and practical theology. I will introduce these next 4 Salt and Light sessions to you on the theme, Defined by Covenant. Today's session highlights encounter with God. What encounters have you had with God throughout your life? Perhaps you knew at the time that you were encountering God, or perhaps it was only in looking back on that experience that you realized you had encountered the divine. In my spiritual journey, one particularly powerful encounter of God remains vivid for me. While on a winter retreat 5 years ago at the Holy Cross Monastery along the Hudson River in New York, I received an image from God while on the river beach at a prayer cove. The Hudson River appeared frozen with a thick crust of ice and snow. As I gazed across it, I momentarily saw water flowing downstream, almost rushing, as if I were seeing the river in the spring thaw. I blinked several times and wondered about this mistake of vision. And as I invited God to speak to me, I sensed God telling me that although the river was completely frozen on the surface, I had seen the mighty current that flowed below, strong enough to carry barges loaded with freight. Although I could not actually see what God was doing, God was indeed moving, and at just the right time, the ice and snow would break free, and a powerful current would be revealed. This encounter with God occurred during a time of waiting for God's direction in my life, and it renewed my trust in God. And God's mighty movement proved true in the coming months. When we have an encounter with God, it is natural to try to want to preserve that experience and try to articulate something about God that we learned through the encounter. For me, I understood in a new way how God is moving even though I may not see it in the present moment. I have found the reflections of Howard Thurman to be particularly helpful in these moments in my spiritual journey. Thurman, the great African-American pastor and mystic, theologian of nonviolence and mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., describes how he cannot command God to meet him in a spiritual encounter. Rather, as Thurman writes in his 1962 book on the temptations of Jesus, quote, "I work at preparing my mind, my spirit, for the moment when God comes to himself in me. When it happens, I experience his presence. When this experience becomes an object of thought and reflection, it is then that my mind creates dogmas, creeds, and doctrines. These are the creations of the mind and are therefore always after the fact of religious experience. But they are always out of date. The religious experience is always current, always fresh. In it, I hear his voice in my own tongue, and in accordance with the grain in my own wood. In that glorious and transcendent moment, it may easily seem to me that all there is God." This reflection from Howard Thurman points out how religious encounter is what keeps our faith alive and fresh, not our religious dogmas, creeds, and doctrines. The Israelites received the law through Moses, but it was the presence of God in the pillar of cloud and fire that kept them going in their wilderness journey. It is this ongoing encounter with God that keeps alive our faith and our whole selves. Today's session also highlights how an encounter with God gives rise to covenant. This was true for the Israelites who embraced God's covenant in the Ten Commandments. These commandments begin with a reminder of their mighty encounter with God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In our contemporary societies, we have a variety of covenants. Financial covenants like loans and mortgages, social covenants like marriage and guardianship of children, faith covenants like baptism and church membership. Some of these covenants arise from an experience of a person or a group of people that leads us to want to make a commitment to them. My marriage certificate, for instance, represents a covenant I made 19 years ago with my spouse, a commitment arising from my encounters with him as a respected follower of Christ, friend, lover, and companion. In today's session, Carol Dirksen points out that our encounters with God and the covenants we embrace because of them have another purpose, a vocation, something God sets apart for us to do and who God calls us to be. The word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means calling. A vocation is a call to partner with God for God's mission in the world, and it often changes slightly based on a particular season of life. While today some people equate vocation with paid work, that is not really what vocation means in a faith sense. It is not necessarily the work we do to provide for our basic needs or for our families. It has a larger purpose than that. God sometimes gives us an individual sense of vocation, and God also gives us a vocation as faith communities. God called the Israelites of the Exodus events to be a blessing to the nations. What has God called you and your faith community to do and be at this moment in history? As you reflect on your encounters with God, consider the covenants you have made in response and what God-given vocation grows out of this.